All right, so we're diving deep today. You've brought quite a collection of material here. 2 Corinthians 8.1-4, notes, excerpts. Looks like we even have a quiz. Someone's pretty serious about generosity, huh?
Well, yeah, I mean, what I find really interesting is that this isn't just some dry theological, lecture or anything. This is Paul writing to real people, to the Corinthians. And he's using this other group, these Macedonians, as this amazing example.
Yeah, you're right. It's like Paul saying, look, check these folks out. They really get it, what giving's all about. But what strikes me is the Macedonians weren't exactly, living the high life, were they?
No, definitely not. I mean, if you look at our sources, especially the one on generosity in the Macedonian churches, you get this picture of real hardship, like serious hardship. A great trial of affliction is how Paul puts it. And yet their giving was just like off the charts, even joyful.
Okay, so right there, that's a huge lesson. It's like their hardship, their generosity wasn't despite it, but almost because of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think if we connect it to the bigger picture here, it absolutely makes sense. Verse 5 really sums it up. First gave their own selves to the Lord. It wasn't just, oh, here's some money, be charitable. It all came from a place of deep devotion.
So they gave themselves to God first, and then the giving of their resources naturally flowed from that. It's like kind of an outpouring.
Exactly. It's like their hearts were just overflowing with gratitude and love for God. So giving was this natural expression of that, not this, burden or obligation.
So this brings up a big question, though, right? How does that translate to us today?
Mm.
I mean, we may not be facing the same struggles as the Macedonians, but we still want to be generous. We want to get this right.
Yeah. For sure. And Paul isn't giving us some strict rule about the exact amount you have to give or anything. What he emphasizes in that briefing doc is willingness and completion. It's not just about thinking, oh, yeah, I should really give something, but actually doing it, like following through.
Putting your money where your mouth is?
Yeah.
Right. Taking action.
Right. And he uses this great analogy, about the Israelites gathering manna. Some gathered a lot, some gathered a little. But in the end, everybody had enough.
So what's that tell us about? Like, how much to give then?
It's not about comparing yourself to others, or trying to one-up somebody. Paul keeps bringing up this concept of equality. And I don't think he means everybody having the exact same amount, but more like everybody having their needs met.
That's an interesting way to think about equality. More about making sure everyone has enough, a kind of balance within the community.
Absolutely. It speaks to a deeper theme that runs through this whole passage, this idea of community and interdependence. We're not just isolated individuals trying to get by on our own. It's about coming together, supporting each other.
Okay, here's where things get really interesting for me, though. Like, why is Paul making such a big deal about giving in the first place? Is it just about the money, or is there something more going on here?
Oh, there's definitely something deeper going on. One thing Paul connects giving to is proving the sincerity of love. Remember, he's writing to the Corinthians, and they haven't always been the easiest group to deal with. He's kind of challenging them, like, put your money where your love is.
So he's saying, back up your words with actions.
Yeah.
Show your faith through your generosity.
Exactly. But it goes even deeper than that. Paul brings up this ultimate example of giving, Jesus. He was rich, but he became poor. For us.
Wait a minute. So you're saying giving is actually like a response to what Christ did for us. Wow, that really changes things.
Yeah, it's like this total shift in perspective. We're not giving out of like guilt or fear or anything like that. We give because we've already been given to. It's like an overflow of gratitude and love for God's grace.
That's powerful. It's like our giving becomes a reflection of God's generosity in our lives.
Exactly. And that's not all. If you look at the generosity in 2 Corinthians 8 notes, particularly that FAQ question number 8, Paul also connects giving to the glory of God.
Okay, so it's not just about helping people, but also about honoring and glorifying God through our giving. It's like this act of worship.
Precisely. It becomes this beautiful way to acknowledge God's sovereignty, expressing our love and devotion to him.
Okay, my mind is officially blown. We've got this amazing example from the Macedonians, the how of giving with willingness and completion, the why, rooted in love, grace, and God's glory. And there's still more.
And how can we forget about Titus? Your notes, especially the timeline and cast of characters, I mention him a lot. He's more than just a delivery guy, wouldn't you say?
He's all over this passage. So what's his deal? What's his role in all of this?
He's more like a facilitator,
Okay.
making sure things run smoothly. The briefing doc highlights how Paul put him in charge of encouraging the Corinthians, collecting the funds, and making sure everything's handled with,
Like
integrity.
a project manager for generosity.
Yeah, exactly. But Paul also sends others with Titus. Why do you think that is?
Hmm. Maybe for transparency, making sure everything's above board and accountable.
You got it. Paul's emphasizing that this isn't just about good intentions, it's also about doing things the right way.
Yeah.
Wise stewardship, that's a message that's still so relevant today, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's not just about throwing money at a problem. It's about reflecting the heart of God in our giving, both in our reasons for doing it and in how we actually go about the process.
Yeah, it's really a beautiful tapestry, isn't it? Weaving together generosity, love, grace, community, accountability. It all points back to this core idea. Giving isn't just about what we give, but who we are as givers. Yeah, it's like it really is a beautiful tapestry,
Hmm.
made up of all these threads: generosity, love, and responsibility. Paul's message here in 2 Corinthians 8, it says so much about what real giving is all about.
And we're really seeing how it goes way beyond just like writing a check or throwing a few dollars in the bucket. It's about getting our hearts aligned with God's heart and letting that transformation flow outward.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's about realizing that everything we have, our time, talents, resources, it's not really ours to just hoard away. We're stewards, right?
Yeah.
Managing these things on behalf of the one who gave them to us in the first place.
So it's not so much about giving up things as it is about giving them back. Like we're returning to God what was always his to begin with, but now we're doing it with like intention and purpose.
That is such a great way to put it. And when we see it that way, when we have that shift in perspective, it changes our whole motivation for giving. We're not giving out of guilt or obligation, but out of love and gratitude. It becomes an act of worship, a way to honor God with everything he's given us.
And that brings us right back to the Macedonians, doesn't it? Their giving wasn't about hitting some specific amount. It was about a heart posture, right? They were already all in with God, so their giving was just like this natural overflow of that.
Exactly. The fact that they found joy in giving, even when they were going through tough times, that really shows how deep their surrender was. It wasn't a burden to them. It was like a privilege. They got to participate in God's work.
It makes you wonder, though, if giving is this reflection of God's grace in our own lives, how do we even begin to figure out what that looks like for each of us individually?
That's the thing. It's such a personal journey. There's no magic formula. But I think it starts with asking ourselves some honest questions, like, where has God already been generous with me? What blessings, big or small, has he poured out in my life?
So it's about recognizing those blessings, taking them in, and then asking, how can I use these to bless others?
Exactly. And it might be through our time, our talents, our money, or even just like offering a listening ear, a word of encouragement. The key is to be open to the ways God's calling us to be conduits of his grace, each of us in our own unique way.
This whole conversation has really been eye-opening for me. It's like 2 Corinthians 8 isn't just some ancient history lesson. It's like this living, breathing message for us today, challenging us to go deeper than just like the mechanics of giving, to see it as this reflection of our faith, a powerful way to actually live out the gospel.
It's this powerful reminder that real generosity is contagious. It inspires other people, strengthens communities, and ultimately it points back to God, to his incredible generosity in giving his own son for us.
There's something else we haven't touched on yet. Paul actually uses the Corinthians' pride to appeal to them in this passage. He tells them their generosity will be proof of their faith, something he can brag about.
Oh yeah, that's a great point. We tend to think of pride as a bad thing, but here Paul's using it almost like a motivator. He knows that the Corinthians, like all of us, want to be seen as good and generous people.
So he's not condemning their pride, but he's kind of like steering it toward a good cause. That's an interesting approach.
It is, isn't it? But it shows how well Paul understood human nature. He knows we all want recognition, and he uses that to encourage them to be generous.
But it's not just about stroking their egos, right? He's connecting their giving to something so much bigger than themselves, to God's glory.
Exactly. Paul's reminding them that what they do has consequences that go way beyond just their own community. Their generosity is going to reflect on them, on him, and ultimately on the whole Christian faith.
So their giving becomes this like powerful witness, right? Showing the world how the gospel changes things. demonstrating God's love and grace in a really tangible way.
Exactly. It's proof that when we get our hearts aligned with God's heart, then our actions will naturally follow. And those actions, they can inspire other people to experience that same kind of radical generosity that we see in the early church.
This is all super inspiring, but let's be real for a minute. Putting all this into practice, it's not always easy.
You're absolutely right. Generosity, especially when it involves sacrifice, it doesn't always come naturally. It takes effort, discipline, and a willingness to get outside of our comfort zones.
It's like working out a muscle, right?
Yeah.
The more we practice generosity, the stronger that muscle gets and the easier it becomes.
That's a great way to think about it. And like any muscle, it needs regular exercise. We can't expect to just wake up one day and be super generous. It's a journey, a process of growth and transformation that happens over time.
But I think that's also what makes it so rewarding when we see our giving actually making a difference in people's lives. It's like fuel for that muscle. It keeps us going.
And it reminds us that giving isn't just about what we give, but who we become along the way. It shapes us, deepens our faith and connects us to something way bigger than ourselves.
We've been on this amazing journey through 2 Corinthians 8, haven't we? Uncovering all these layers of meaning and insight. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to one more thing that keeps coming up in our sources. This idea of giving ourselves to the Lord first.
Ah, yes. That's the foundation, the bedrock of true generosity, the wellspring where it all starts.
But it can feel a little abstract sometimes, right? Like, what does it actually mean to give ourselves to the Lord? Not just in theory, but in real everyday life.
That's the million-dollar question,
Yeah.
and it deserves some serious thought. But I think it starts with recognizing that, in the end, we don't own ourselves. We belong to God, and our lives are meant to be lived in service to Him.
So it's about surrender, right? Surrendering our will to His will, trusting that He knows what's best for us and letting Him guide us.
Exactly. It's about lining up our priorities with His priorities, seeking His guidance, and letting go of our own selfish desires.
And I think that's where we find true freedom. When we stop trying to control everything and just surrender, that's when God can really work in and through us.
I love that. And I think that's the perfect way to lead into the final part of our deep dive. We'll explore what that surrender looks like in practice and how it empowers us to live lives of radical generosity and love.
Man, we've really been on a journey with 2 Corinthians 8, haven't we? It's amazing how much there is to unpack in what seems like, a pretty straightforward passage about giving.
Yeah, it really shows how connected everything is in our faith, Generosity, it's not just this isolated thing we do. It's tied to our relationship with God, with our community, even with ourselves.
We talked about giving ourselves to the Lord first. That, surrender being the foundation for everything else. But what does that actually look like, Not just as this big idea, but in our everyday lives.
Right. It has to be more than just a concept. Well, I think it starts with a change in how we see things, recognizing that our time, our talents, the things we have, they're not really ours to just hold on to. We're managing them for God, the one who gave them to us in the first place.
So it's less about giving things up and more about giving back. We're returning to God what was always His, but now we're doing it with this new awareness, with purpose.
I like that. It's a good way to put it. And when we view it that way, our motivation changes too. We're not giving because we feel guilty or like we have to. It comes from gratitude, from love. It's a way to worship, a way to honor God with all that He's given us.
And that takes us back to those Macedonians, doesn't it? Their generosity wasn't about a specific amount. It was about where their heart was at. They were all in with God already, so their giving was just like a natural expression of that.
Exactly. The fact that they were joyful in their giving, even in the middle of hard times, that just shows how fully they'd surrendered. It wasn't a burden for them. It was a privilege to be part of God's work.
So that makes me think, if giving is really about reflecting God's grace in our lives, how do we figure out what that looks like? For each of us individually, I mean.
It's definitely a journey. There's no one right answer that fits everybody. But I think it starts with being honest with ourselves and asking, where has God been generous to me? What gifts and blessings, big or small, has He poured out in my life?
So taking stock of those blessings,
Right.
Acknowledging them, and then asking, okay, so how can I use these to be a blessing to others?
You got it. It might be through our time, our talents, our money. It could even be as simple as just listening to somebody, offering a word of encouragement. The important thing is being open to those opportunities where God's calling us to be His hands and feet, Each of us in our own way.
This has been such an incredible conversation. It's 2 Corinthians 8, it's not just some old story. It's a message that's still so alive and relevant for us today. It pushes us to think differently about what it means to give, to go beyond just the surface level, and see it as this expression of our faith, a real way to live out the gospel.
It reminds us that true generosity, it spreads, it inspires other people, builds up community, and in the end, it all points back to how incredibly generous God is. He gave his own son for us after all.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. If giving is really about reflecting God's grace in our lives, what does that look like for you right here, right now? What opportunities has God given you to share his love and generosity with the world around you?
I hope this exploration of 2 Corinthians 8 has inspired you to embrace a life of giving that's joyful, intentional, not giving out of obligation, but out of a heart that's surrendered to God and transformed by his grace.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. And until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deeper into the truth that changes our lives.